go to our website, you can see at a glance what's going on across the nation. This episode will be recorded. We do have our own YouTube channel, so you can always replay this and share. And we do support adoptee rights legislation, obviously, and we are available to speak at any of your events. The other thing I wanted to share a little bit about, again, is we do have some upcoming calls with David Bull. David is an addiction and recovery expert, and he's been holding bi-monthly calls. David, can you just give us a little shout out there, please? There we go.
There you go.
David?
Thank you very much, Marcy. I appreciate that. Yes, the information is there. You can find it on the NAAPunited.org page under Adoptee Paths to Recovery. We meet every other Tuesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Time. We talk about recovery, initiating recovery, building motivation for recovery, challenges in recovery, and all paths are welcome. Whatever you describe recovery as, that's what we're there to support you in. So please join us if you can.
Thank you, David. Okay, I would like to go ahead, and gives me great pleasure to introduce Betsy Norris at this time. I'd like to share a little bit about her with you. She is an adoptee who searched for and was united with her birth parents and siblings in 1986 when she was in her mid-20s. She emerged from that experience with strong convictions about the lifelong journey of adoption for all involved and the need for systemic change. She founded Adoption Network Cleveland in 1988 and was a volunteer for the first 7 years and has been the executive director since '95. Over a 25-year period, Betsy took lead on legislation to reform Ohio's adoption laws, and as a result, all Ohio-born adoptees adopted have access to their original birth certificates, including 400,000 adoptees in Ohio's formerly closed period, starting in March 2015. So please join me in welcoming Betsy Norris to the happy hour.
Well, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, and definitely I'm happy to be working together as state neighbors. So
Yes.
thank you. And before I even get started, let me congratulate you on Steve Inskeep. That's fantastic public awareness for you all and for all of us.
Yes.
So it's been really, really fun to watch that unfold and to listen and read and be part of that. So, it's interesting, as you were reading my bio, I realized, sometimes I tell people that I went back to school, and I'm going to start at the beginning here in a minute, but halfway through this whole thing of starting Adoption Network and then coming to work for the organization after being a volunteer for 7 years, I went back to school and got a certificate in a graduate program for nonprofit management. And through that process, I realized, like, oh, sometimes people actually like write out a business plan and get funding, and then they start a nonprofit. Like, what a unique idea, So every time I, hear that bio, it makes me realize, or think about that. So I want to keep this informal, and I think on Zoom you can raise your hand, right? So if anybody has, I can't see everybody because there's a couple pages of people, but if anybody has a burning question, you can put it in chat and or raise your hand, and I will try to be as responsive as possible. I'm going to tell you my story, both my kind of personal journey and then Adoption Network's journey, and some of the highlights along the way. As Marcy said, I'm an adoptee, and I was born in 1960 here in Ohio. My parents were very open with me. They always told me that I was adopted. It was never a negative or difficult thing really in my family. But as a kid, I had flaming red hair, and I would literally be out on the street with my mom, and little old ladies would come up to us and say, "Oh, where'd she get her red hair?" And my mom would kind of say, "Oh, there's Irish blood in the family," or, kind of cover it over. Or if I were to answer, I would just say, "Well, I'm adopted, so we don't know." And so if I was the one that answered and said that, then these little old ladies would be kind of like, "Oh my God, I didn't mean to bring that up," and kind of shrink back. And so I even though it was a very positive environment at home, it was a little bit of a mixed message. My mom wasn't open with other people outside of the family about it. You know, people didn't respond well when I brought it up. And so, you know, I started to realize, I think pretty early on, that there was a lot more to this than the, you know, version of the story that I was getting at home. And I was always a curious kid. I asked my parents a lot of questions about being adopted. They, you know, which was common for the era, they knew literally nothing about my background. They told me that when the social workers were handing me over to them, they kind of expressed that they were surprised that I had red hair, maybe almost in an apologetic kind of way. But they didn't know how old my birth parents were. They didn't know what had led to the, you know, what their relationship was or what their background was, what had led to the adoption, what the circumstances were. They didn't know anything at all about my medical history. They were handed a card that told them what brand of formula I drank and how much. I was 16 days old when I was placed with them. And you know, like all families, my adoptive family had some issues and problems. I don't think there's any family out there that doesn't, you know, but I remember at an early age, you know, thinking a fair amount about my adoption. And I think that my adoptive family, my parents would have definitely given me information if they had it, or if they realized that they could maybe go back to the agency and get some information. I think they would have done that. I think they honestly didn't even know, you know, how to answer my questions. They did assure me that I was conceived in love and that's what was important, which I don't think they knew that, but, you know, I guess it sounded good. So I grew up with a lot of questions, and, you know, as I'm sure just about everybody on the call has experienced, not a lot of role models for discussing adoption anywhere. And so it was kind of a lonely journey. I had several friends that were adopted. I think I've always been a little bit of a magnet for adoptees. I look back at my childhood and my adolescent years, and I kind of collected adopted friends. But I never heard a birth parent story, to the extent that I remember kind of wondering, maybe kind of subconsciously, but kind of consciously, you know, did my birth parents forget that they had me? Like, is it that traumatic of a situation that you just, you know, bury it so deep that you can't even access those memories? Which of course, you know, is ridiculous, but because you never heard anybody ever talking about it, you know, I had nothing to base what a birth parent experience might have been like. And when I was in my 20s, luckily, I had the opportunity to meet a birth parent and to talk with them about what their experience had been. At the same time, I had become an RN, which piqued my interest in medical history all the more, learning all the different diseases that can be genetic and, you know, beyond diseases, other traits. So I was, my interest was definitely piqued. And I worked in a child psych unit, an adolescent mental health unit. And a lot of the kids that found their way to needing our services on that inpatient unit were adopted. And so I tried to do research and have workshops for the different staff on my unit, brought it up in treatment team with the psychiatrists and the social workers and the other nurses, to more fully understand why adoptees would be so overrepresented. I actually counted up, nobody was tracking it, and I counted up just anecdotally from the families that I was aware of that the kids were adopted, that we were serving, and it was about 20% of our patients in any given year, whereas about 2% of the population is adopted. And so I was shocked that nobody was, you know, talking about that. And so that added, you know, more layers to kind of that secrecy, or we don't talk about this. So that was like the early 80s. I was in a bookstore when I was 25, and I ran across the book, The Adoption Triangle, which many of you might be familiar with, and couldn't believe that there was actually a book written on this subject at the time. You know, now there's, you know, enough to line the shelf in the bookstore, or more than one shelf. But at the time there was, you know, Lost and Found by Betty Jean Lifton and The Adoption Triangle. And those were pretty much the, you know, the only two books. And I bought it and stayed up all night reading it. just in awe that somebody had put into words so much of what had been just internal to me that I don't think I'd even fully put into words, because I really didn't have anybody to talk to about all this. But for the first time, that really gave me access to reunion stories and birth parent stories. And I pretty much knew that my adoptive parents would be supportive and helpful if they could be. But the birth parent angle was the part that was such a mystery to me. And so it was a very lonely journey. And I embarked on a search. There were no groups for me to connect with really in Ohio. And I joined the ALMA registry in New York State and did what I could to try to search, spun my wheels for quite a number of months, not getting a whole lot of information. I did contact the agency that I was adopted through and ask for my non-identifying information. They charged a fee and had to have something notarized, so I sent that in. They called me several months later wanting to know if I still lived at the same address so that they could mail it to me. And I said, I've been waiting a long time for this, can I come down and get it? And the social worker was obviously quite uncomfortable with that, but I did go and meet with him. Getting ahead of myself, but just to finish that piece of the story, I thought it was a little odd because the piece of paper that he gave me that was 1 page of typed information said that both my birth parents had blonde hair and some other information about them. And it's like, okay, I'm a nurse and I know a little bit about genetics, and I don't think you get a redhead, from 2 blonde people, because those are all recessive genes. This doesn't quite add up. But I figured, the agency is like God, they're the ones with the records, so they would know. Later in my search, I disproved every piece of information on that page and went back to the agency to ask them, what happened. And I'm sure it probably was honest human error. They said that the person sitting at the microfiche machine had, stepped out for a minute to address something and then come back, and the microfiche machine got jostled over to somebody else's record. So luckily I had taken matters into my own hand and done my search through the meantime. Just to close out that piece, I did go back to the agency with my birth parents and letters from my adoptive parents asking for the actual record that they held, and they still wouldn't give it to me. The lawyer said no. But in the meantime, luckily, I did continue on my search. Probably 6 months after I got started, the ALMA office wrote me back, and there wasn't a match in the registry for me, but they wrote me back and said that according to what they had about state laws across the country, that I should have access to my birth certificate. I had not run across that information anywhere. This is pre-internet, I'd been to the agency. They hadn't mentioned to me anything about being able to access my birth certificate. I just thought that they were closed, as they are across the country. And so obviously that was a big leg up in the whole thing. And I got the forms, got that notarized, sent it off to Columbus. And they were extremely efficient. And within, I think, less than 2 weeks, I had my original birth certificate in my hand. I got it on a Saturday. It was December 14th. I remember standing there with that envelope in my hand, knowing that when I opened it, that was going to change my world in a big way. And I opened it and took a look at it. And the first name I saw was Victoria Faith Boyer. And I thought, wow, my birth mother had such a beautiful name. I thought it was a very poetic name. And as I looked closer at it, I realized that that's what she had named me. And her name was down below, and which just floored me. I'd never even thought about having a different name. I just thought I'd be baby girl, whatever. And so again, to continue that thread of the story, she later told me that she had named me, that in her mind, the operative name was Faith, given the circumstances. Not that she was necessarily particularly religious. Her family was Quaker, but she, given the circumstances, she called me Faith, but she put Victoria first, in part to be a message to me if I had ever had access to the name. And also because she thought that if my adoptive parents had my name, that maybe they would keep the middle name, but probably change the first name. So it turned out my adoptive parents didn't have any of it, so they just changed it altogether. So obviously having my birth certificate opened up a lot. It gave me the address where she was living during the pregnancy, which was an unwed mother's home that was across the street from the Cleveland Clinic where I was working. I could literally see the old mansion that the unwed mother's home had been in out of the window of my workplace. And so I spent a lot of time staring at that building and thinking about her staring out those windows. And it also gave me the address of her usual residence, which was in Wallingford, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Philadelphia. And so again, this is pre-internet. So I went to the library and looked up stuff in the phone book. I took a trip to Wallingford. The first time that I went there, I was very timid and didn't do as much research as I really later realized that I could have. And so I ended up going back. I did contact her high school and tried to piece together her graduation from the local high school there. And they actually transposed the year of graduation. So she graduated, in effect, she graduated in 1956, but they had that she graduated in 1965 just because they transposed the numbers by mistake. My original birth certificate said that she was 21 when I was born. If she had graduated high school in 65, she would have been about 14 or 13 when I was born. And then because I was still working off the wrong non-identifying information, that non-identifying information said that she had been 16 when I was born. And so it was, it was quite a journey. And I kind of threw out the 21 thinking, that's an easy age to write down on something official like a birth certificate. So she was probably not 21 if I had these 3 different ages that I was working on. And I think I'd envisioned her more as a teenager. In the end, it did turn out that she was 21 when I was born. She had just turned 21 the month before. Continued on my search, and it probably took me, I look back and today, of course, all of this could happen in a day or less. But at the time, the whole thing took me about a year. And even from the time I got my birth certificate in December, I was not able to make contact with her in May. I didn't have all the pieces falling into place until mid-May. And so when I found her, I had enough information to know that she either owned or managed a small company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I had her home phone number and her work phone number. And I knew that she had a husband and 3 teenage sons at home. And so I don't think I would ever recommend this to anybody in any other circumstances, but I decided to call her at work because I figured that she would have a private place where she could close the door and have a conversation rather than having a bunch of teenage sons looking at her like, why are you crying? What's going on? Who's on the phone? And so I called her at work and chose my words very carefully, prepared myself as best I could for all the different responses that she might have. Other than reading a couple books, I had not really talked to a whole lot of people that had reunion experiences. And so I was kind of making up as I went along. Got her on the phone and told her that this was Betsy Norris. I was calling from Cleveland, Ohio. I had something very private and personal to speak with her about. Was this a good time to talk? And she said that it was. And so I let in with my date of birth and that I'd been born at the Cleveland Clinic, and that I was doing and adopted, and that I was doing research about my background, which had led me to her. Just seemed like the most sensitive way that I could put it and let her put 2 and 2 together about what that meant. And before I even got all that out, she said, "Oh my God, I've been praying for this call for 26 years." Which was not on my list of all the things I'd prepared for. So I think I was the one that was speechless. Luckily, she was very well poised about the whole thing. She started asking me questions. She asked me if I had red hair. She had seen me as an infant, and I had enough red hair even then for her to know. She asked me what I did for a living, and I told her I was a nurse. And she started telling me about her mother, whose name was Betty, who was a nurse who had red hair. And making all kinds of connections. And then a little ways into the phone call, she said, "Well, Bob is going to be so happy." I said, "Well, who's Bob?" And she, much to my surprise, explained how she had married my birth father and they were still married. And so those 3 teenagers at home were my full brothers. I think I was totally the one that had to be scraped off the floor after all that. You know, she was very poised about the whole thing, luckily. But I just had completely thought that they'd gone their separate ways, and this is why it all just took place the way that it did. And so it was a wonderful reunion and continues to be. I've known them now since 1986. I'd have to do the math, but that's a long time, more than half my life. And they've been grandparents to my son. My uncles or my brothers have been uncles, and you know, their families, their kids are my son's cousins. And they met my adoptive parents before my parents passed away, which was really special for me. I think, you know, it was one of those types of things that you don't even necessarily know what's missing until you see it or you get it back. When my birth mother and my adoptive mother met and hugged and shared tears, it made me whole in a way that I didn't even know was missing until it happened. And so I was extremely fortunate. At the same time, this really triggered a grief process. You know, so my birth parents were married since I was 1.5 years old, and were, you know, still married when I found out my birth father just passed away last summer. But my adoptive parents had gotten divorced when I was 9 years old or 8 years old, and you know, had kind of an acrimonious relationship. And so, you know, finding a family that was intact and really, you know, a pretty healthy family. Not that I would treat in my adoptive family, but it, you know, it opened up, you know, definitely a period of kind of confusion and grief for me, and not a place that I had a whole lot of support because I didn't have a lot of people in my world that I could talk to about it. And because my search had centered in Philadelphia, I had gone on my trips to Philadelphia to search. I had tried to time them when the Adoption Forum, which was I don't know if they're still around, a group in Philadelphia for a long time. When they had their meetings, or they had a full day conference. And so I planned my search trips to correspond with some of their meetings. So my dream had really become to start an organization in Ohio to help support people and to help people through. I figured, you know, maybe I'd struggled through something that somebody else might not have to face alone, and that maybe I'd learned some things that could be helpful for people. You know, with my nursing background and my background in child psychiatry, I thought, you know, maybe I could be helpful. I jumped in with both feet, and there was actually somebody who had volunteered to organize a regional conference of the American Adoption Congress here in Cleveland. And you were supposed to be an organization to be able to hold a regional conference, but somehow they'd let her volunteer just as an individual. And she was trying to put this together, and I think feeling a little bit overwhelmed, trying to put together a whole conference, one person, and not having a, you know, support organization or anything here to help back that up. And so she was looking for help. I'd never heard of the American Adoption Congress at the time, but it sounded like a good idea to me. And so we put together a conference. And so before I kind of named Adoption Network, to put together this conference and have it be an entity. And then I knew that it would be a group that would continue on, as that was my goal. Kate Otis, the person that I did the conference with, really was focused on creating this conference and not necessarily an ongoing long-term thing. And although she was fine that, you know, that was my goal. And so we put on a regional conference of the AAC. And at the time, we thought that if we had 80 or 90 people that came, that would be successful. I think that was the size that they typically were. We didn't know who to invite for speakers. So we wrote to Betty Jean Lifton and to Ruben Panner and all the, you know, people that have written the books out there that we were reading, and thinking that we'd be lucky if one of them said yes. It turned out they all said yes. And so we had quite a conference, and we ended up with over 200 people, and it was a totally transformative weekend. And so for me, there was no turning back after that. And I just started calling meetings of Adoption Network afterwards, and having triad support groups. Cleveland is the type of town where people identify as being East Side or West Side. So we started out from the beginning having 2 monthly meetings, one on the East Side and one on the West Side, in 2 different locations every month. Again, this is pre-internet, so a lot of people started coming, and we got a lot of publicity early on, and we literally had over 100 people sometimes at those meetings. And so we had kind of a core group of people who got involved, kind of a leadership group, we couldn't keep up with the demand. So we started having 3 meetings a month, 4 meetings a month, and they were still huge. So that was an interesting period of time. At the same time, the whole birth certificate issue to me was a social justice issue when I realized that I, in fact, could get my birth certificate, and that people just a few years younger than me could not get their birth certificates. And what that meant, not only for my being able to complete my search, but being able to see evidence of my birth. I remember telling people when I was a kid, when they talked about being born, I would kind of joke like, oh, I was hatched, or I'm an alien, or I was really I didn't know what time I was born. I didn't have, anybody to tell me that birth story. And so it was, it was meaningful in many different ways on many different levels. And so I, from the beginning, just really felt that this was a social justice issue, and that the law should change. And I'd never worked on state legislation, but totally jumped in with both feet to start advocating for legislation. So there was a group in Ohio who had just gotten the first bill introduced about access to records in 1988, 89. And I jumped on board that effort. And obviously that bill didn't pass, but we had successive bills. And the next thing you know, I was leading the effort and writing the legislation and all kinds of stuff that a few months or a year or two previous, I would have never thought I'd be doing. So this became, quite a busy, as many of you who are adoption activists or group leaders can relate to, I'm sure, this became quite a busy endeavor. And there was, more than enough demand to, more than enough need for me to be working 40 plus hours a week just on adoption stuff. And luckily my nursing career, at the time the Cleveland Clinic had an opportunity for nurses to work every weekend, 2 12-hour shifts every weekend, and get paid, I think just short of full-time, but with full-time benefits. And so I started doing that and worked 2 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Saturdays and Sundays. So I could do this during the week. I was a registered lobbyist in Columbus during that time. And oh, thanks for posting that video. I'll tell you a little bit about that piece of the story too. And it just, grew very, very quickly and took over my life. Luckily I was single and my son wasn't born yet, so I was able to just jump in. And so during that period, I think part of what was troubling to me was that my goal was really to build a sustainable nonprofit organization that would outlive my tenure or, live beyond however long I was able to do this. And it was kind of an unsustainable model. I was the president of the board, and it had become a full-time job, and I was functioning much more like a traditional nonprofit executive director. I tell people now I hardly knew what a nonprofit was, and I was young and naive and energetic, and maybe it's a good thing because I'm not sure I would have jumped in quite as much if I had known, although I guess I would have. But I was resourceful and I learned a lot and kind of taught myself what I needed to know. But several years into it, I was very aware that if something happened to me, then the organization would probably go under because I was really the driving force. And so to make a long story short, we did our board did strategic planning and got some funding and decided to hire a director. And I told the board, I'm going to be a candidate, so I want to stay out of the process, but I totally think you should hire whoever you think you should advertise and interview, and hire whoever you think can take the organization to the next level and help this become sustainable. And if it's not me, I'll stay on as a volunteer and I'll be the president of the board or whatever other role is needed. And in some ways hiring me was a drawback because it didn't increase our capacity at all because I was already doing the job. And so in some ways we would have been bringing on more capacity if we had hired a full-time person other than me. So obviously the board hired me and that was 1995. So I left nursing and have been working at Adoption Network. There was a couple of years where I did nursing just like occasionally and then phased out of that altogether. So that's kind of the early period of Adoption Network. We started adding staff slowly and adding people on as we went, and several years into it, I guess 2001, 2002, had the opportunity to be part of a large project and take on a large project around the need for homes for kids in foster care who were destined to age out of foster care without permanency. I should back up and say that from the very beginning, I felt very committed to creating an organization that, so we had a huge focus on adoptees and birth parents and access to records, but I also really realized or recognized that a lot of the power in adoption, a lot of the money and the power in adoption was centered more with the agencies and the adoptive families. And I really wanted to create change. So, obviously I like doing some of the service aspects as well, but my goal is really to change at least our little slice of the world, as much as we can. And so we, from the beginning took a pretty kind of holistic view, trying to balance the needs and the communication among the adoption triad. Anyways, we were the lead on this Adopt Cuyahoga's Kids. Cuyahoga is the county that Cleveland is in, around mostly teenagers who are waiting in foster care, who were destined to age out of foster care. And that caused a huge growth spurt. So I think in 2002, 2003, when we started getting involved with that project, we had 3 staff positions. And as a result of being asked to be the lead on that project, we maxed out at like 25 positions at one point. We have 12 staff right now. And so the Adoption Network's mission is very multifaceted. So we work with adoptees and birth parents, but we also work a lot with adoptive families, mostly who are adopting from foster care. And then we do a lot of professional education and that type of thing as well. So I'm sorry, I feel like I've been a little bit all over the place, but thanks for sharing all that in the chat. So in terms of access to records, because I know that's probably an interest of many of you, we had bills, as I mentioned, over and over from the late 80s through the mid 90s. In the mid 90s, Ohio passed a bill that we didn't really get behind, but it was like the issue had gotten some momentum, and they passed a bill to create access to records for future adoptions. So to stop closing them upon adoption, unless a birth parent requested that they be closed. And so we didn't, that's not what we were going for. Our first bills were actually not only access to records for adoptees, but also access to records for birth parents. So as the first bills were crafted so that adoptive parents could get the original birth certificate while the adoptee was a minor, that right would then transfer to the to the adoptee as soon as they became of age, and that the birth parent, when the adoptee was an adult, could get access to the amended birth certificate. Now, that was an idea whose time had not come. And so in our later attempts, including our successful attempt in 2013, we narrowed it down to the adoptee specifically. So we had these bill attempts over and over. In the early 2000s, we took a little bit of a break in terms of not having legislation, but always searching for a sponsor. We do a lobby day once a year at the State House on whatever different child welfare issues, legislative issues we're working on. And so every year that would be on our list, and looking for the right mix of sponsors, because that, as many of you know, can make or break your effort. And in 2012, we were able to pull together a group of sponsors that was really, I look at them as kind of the dream team. So our main sponsor was he's not adopted himself, but his siblings are. And so he grew up in a family that was formed largely through adoption, and had watched his siblings struggle with the access to records. They weren't born in Ohio, they were born in New York State, but he'd really watched them struggle. We had another sponsor who her sister is a birth mother, actually somebody that we had helped years ago, and I didn't even know they were sisters because they have different last names. And so when I met with her about the bill, and she said, "Oh yeah, you helped my sister so-and-so," who knew? And another sponsor who was an adoptee himself, and then another sponsor who was an adoptive parent. And so that's kind of what it took, was to have people who really understood it on a personal level and could be champions for the bill. We had worked for years on overcoming the opposition, which unfortunately centered with Ohio Right to Life. And so we had worked on that organization, and that's a whole nother presentation. So I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but we were able to get Ohio, we were trying to get them to just be neutral. In the end, they came and supported our bill, which is another story, but we were able to get them to change their mind and to realize that the sky would not fall, and that adoptions had not been halted in other states that opened up their records and that type of thing. And so that was key. I think another thing that really was changing was, even though it wasn't as popular as it is even today, DNA testing had started. And so I think the legislators started to really realize that open or closed records that birth parents can be found. We had a clean bill all the way through 2013, and we had not one person come to any of the hearings to testify against it. We had hordes of people testifying for it all the way through the House and the Senate and the committees. And then unfortunately, the Senate president woke up one day a couple weeks before the end of the legislative session and decided that, in his words, birth parents should be able to take their name off their birth certificate before it was released to the adoptee if they wanted to. And so that was a huge surprise, because we had been totally moving toward this clean bill. We had a really fantastic core group of advocates, and then lots of other advocates across the state, some of whom I think are on this call. So, our sponsor, I think he texted me like on a Sunday night and said, hey, this is what the Senate president is saying. We knew that we had, our state Senate has 33 people. We'd already passed the House, which is 99 representatives, and there's 33 senators, and we knew that we had 32 or 33 votes out of the Senate. And so we were sure this was going to go to the floor and it was going to pass. It already passed, or I guess it was just about to pass committee, and he was saying he wouldn't bring it to a vote even though we knew we had the votes. So huge choice point. Like, do we just scrap this bill altogether and try again in a few more years? Or the Senate president is actually still in the legislature. He wasn't going anywhere for a while. We had one of our members who, on our core team, who was doing the math. And, although we all philosophically agree with leave no adoptee behind, he was also doing the math and saying, well, okay, if we wait, if it takes 3 more years to pass this bill, here's the number of people that will have died without access to their birth certificate. And so you're going to probably be leaving a lot more people behind if you don't do this. And so, a lot of thought went into that. In the end, we did, for one, recognize that this was really our sponsor's decision, not ours. Even if I think at that point, if we had said pull the bill, he probably would have moved forward. But we were able to help him make a compromise that I think was the least harm done in something that none of us wanted. And so we insisted that we could only continue to not oppose the bill if they, that the records couldn't be opened simultaneously to the adoptee and the birth parent being able to redact their name. We also took the Senate president very, very literally, and he was saying the birth parent should be able to, actually he was saying the birth mother should be able to take her name off. And so we're kind of like, okay, he probably hasn't seen, I shouldn't be saying all this if this is recorded, but he probably hasn't seen a birth certificate to know what all else is on there. And so we said, okay, if the birth parent takes their name off, there's still an address, there's still the child's name, there's, our bottom line was that the birth certificate would be accessible to the adoptee. And so the birth certificate would still be accessible with a fair amount of information present on it. And so we were able to have him negotiate that it would be a 1-year period, which was already built into the bill, a 1-year lead-in period, originally for Vital Records to get their act together to be able to logistically do what they needed to do to be able to find and release the records. So during that year, the birth parents could come and ask for their name to be redacted. So we thought that, 100 or 200 people might do that. So 200, and I think it was 259 birth parents did ask for their names to be redacted out of the 400,000 records that were impacted by that bill. And so it was bittersweet, when it passed, it was not what we wanted, but it opened up the records for people. And, like I said, weighing all of the different factors and how long it might have taken to do it differently, if ever, there was a lot of momentum to get it passed then. And so anyways, we celebrated opening day on March 20th, 2015. Some of you were there. Paige, I see you celebrating. We had hundreds of people that came to Columbus. It was a very exciting time, definitely a peak moment in our history. Vital Records had made it very clear that they were not going to be handing birth certificates out over the counter, that they would only be allowing people to apply for their birth certificates. So at first we thought that not a whole lot of people would travel to Columbus to just hand in their application that they could do through the mail. And we organized a small celebration. We were going to go, down and stay overnight and do some things. So we put out there asking, who all was planning to be around so that we could be together. And we started hearing from hundreds of people across the country and some people from other countries who flew to Columbus to be part of this. And so we had to scale up our event greatly from what our original plan was. And it was quite the event. So let me tell one more quick story and then I'll stop. I don't usually talk this much. But let me tell the quick story that's in that film that you all posted the link to. So through the process of our bills in the early 90s, my adoptive father, who'd always been very supportive of my search, thrilled to meet my birth parents, completely supportive of me, had told me if he was adopted, he thinks, he would also have searched, completely understood and supported my need to know. He came to me in 92 or 93 and, or maybe 91, confessed to me that he had been part of a small group of people who had taken action that resulted in the records being closed, and the law that passed that closed the records in Ohio in 64. And Ohio was unique in that law that went into effect in 64 didn't close the records before the law went into effect. In many states, they closed backwards and forwards. In Ohio, they only closed forwards to the people touched in the situation. And so he came and told me that he had initiated this, and that was quite a surprise. he was a young attorney when he adopted my older brother, who was born in the late 50s, and then me in 1960. And he had, and I think this is an important piece of history to know for people who are advocating for access to records, of the historical context of how they got closed, because Ohio is unique in some ways, but not unique in others. He had been told when he was adopting us through the agency that the records were closed. Like any new adoptive parent in that time frame, he didn't know much about birth parents, but he was worried that somebody could find his family, or that somebody might show up on the doorstep. These adoptions were closed, and that's what he'd been told. And the agency assured him that everything was closed and he didn't need to worry about it. And being the young, curious attorney that he was, he went down to Vital Records on the county level in Cleveland, just to see what would happen if he asked for my brother's birth certificate. And so he went up to the window and asked for my brother's birth certificate. And they handed him the original and the amended, just paper clipped together, not asking who he was. He could have been the media, he could have been the birth father, so he was shocked, and he thought that those should be closed from the public. He was not attempting to close them from the parties involved in the adoption. His interest was to make them not available over the counter, at the county office. And he got together a group of other attorneys, other adoptive parents, and they worked to craft a bill to close the records. And later I did find documents where they had discussed whether or not they should be open to the people on the records, the people touched by the adoption. And he had advocated that they shouldn't be, but there were other parents on the committee that advocated that they should be. I think he'd kind of lost track of the legislation. He thought that it was earlier. He wasn't completely sure until he came and told me about it, that the legislation he had initiated was in fact the legislation that we were trying to overturn. But he came back in the early 90s and testified for our legislation, and stood up to the legislature and said, hey, I'm the one that did this, and it's been harmful, and it went further than I realized it was going to, and it's been hurtful for people. It's gone too far, and it should be changed. So Gene Strauss made a short film about that that's on our website. So if you're interested in the legislative issues on our website, there's a whole section on public policy and on the bill that ultimately passed. It's got a collection of films that Gene Strauss made, that film and then others around opening day, and all the different testimony from that last effort. So anyways, I've talked a lot. So let me stop and see what questions or comments you all have.
Yeah, who would like to start the first question? I'd like to also hear from some of the residents in Ohio that were there on opening day and share your experiences. That would be pretty cool. Becky Drennan, you want to take yourself
Yes.
up? Tell us about it.
Sure. I think what I had just posted in the comments is that I traveled to Columbus that day with Lynn Grubb and Paige Strickland, and we were all, Paige and I were Ohio adoptees who already had our birth certificates because of the dates when we were born, and then Lynn was an Illinois adoptee who already had her birth certificate. So we were kind of a little bit unique in that we were kind of on the outside looking in. We knew how important it was. But to be a part of the energy that was there was pretty incredible. I won't ever forget that March. It was kind of a rainy, dreary day where we left from the hotel and went to the Bureau of Vital, I forget what the office name was, where adoptees would be applying for their birth certificates. And it was, I had tears in my eyes just walking down there, even though because you could feel the emotion and you could feel how important it was for the people who were there. The night before, there was an open mic, and I was outside sitting at a table, so I could just hear bits and pieces of it. But I could hear how people had been touched by that. There were a couple of reunions that happened at that event that happened the night before. it was just a perfect combination of the people involved, the timing, the energy, and the event that was put together that really celebrated how important it was for these folks to be able to get their birth certificates. So anyhow, I'd recommend going. If you're in a state that is going to have some kind of a celebration, I would sure recommend going.
Thank you, Becky.
I didn't
Rhino?
know about that in terms of the reunion. We had a birth father that we'd been working with, searching for several months before opening day. And because the records weren't opening for the birth parent, we've been plodding along in his search. And then we got a call from an adoptee, one of the hundreds of people that was RSVPing to come to the event. And somehow right before the event, we realized that this was father and son. And so we connected them and they met at the event.
I don't think I knew that piece of the story. That is really neat.
Pretty moving. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else here from Ohio that wanted to share about the bill celebration or just any general questions? There's been a lot of chat in the chat room, Betsy.
I think Barbara's raising her hand.
Yeah, thanks. I'm multitasking. So the significance of I was an adoptee born in Ohio and adopted in New York State. So I had 2 states that I could not get my records. Everything was closed. Every door was closed, even for non-identifying information. And years ago, I had contacted Adoption Network Cleveland and talked to Linda Bellini, and it was all dead ends. And so I was bitterly disappointed until the legislation lobbying continued to catch fire. And, eventually 2014-ish, that finally, after all those years, there was some movement to approve that legislation. And so then we had to wait, what was it, 18 months, Betsy?
15 months, yeah.
15 months. And it was, it was a long, I've already waited 50 years, so what's another 15 months, right? But still, this has been the most significant piece of legislation that, April 13th will be the day that I was able to lay eyes officially on my original birth certificate and see my mother's her name for the very first time. And it has been life-changing. And, thank you, Betsy, and everybody that, the years that you lobbied, that you tried to do whatever you could, and it seemed like it was futile. It isn't. It's definitely, the dividends have paid off and will continue to pay off for generations to come. So, thanks.
Thank you.
And I guess one thing I would like to add to that just a little bit is I really appreciate you sharing the, kind of the entire process as far as that bill going from a clean bill to a bill that had some restrictions in it, because there's so much kind of back and forth today in the adoption world about, no adoptee left behind versus, take whatever bill you can get or whatever. And that, I think going through that process, I think every state has to look at that individually. And I really appreciate you sharing that entire story about why Ohio's bill, and it just took one person. And I think, isn't it in Texas, isn't it the same way? There's like one person or one small group that keeps knocking the legislation down.
Our previous legislation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ohio Right to Life had been our big challenge in previous attempts. But like I said, with the Senate, really it was one person in the end, because the Senate
Mhm.
president who held the power, whether it got voted, if he had said it could be voted on and let the legislators decide, it would have passed. But he had the sole opportunity to say, well, I'm not even going to bring it for a vote unless you make this compromise. And so, like I said, that was very difficult. And we kind of had our bottom line and our principles that we wanted to make sure were upheld. And although we didn't want the compromise, we felt, like it was better. It's hard to say that it was better. I don't know. It was better than waiting 5 more years or however many more years it probably would have taken.
And one of the co-sponsors really went to bat when the Ohio Department of Health didn't didn't redact appropriately the way the legislation had intended, correct?
I had even met with the Department of Health and the director and the lawyer and talked to them about exactly how they were going to handle rejections. We were very careful about exactly how that got written, so that it couldn't go beyond the intent. And they had told me that they had shown me a birth certificate and showed me how they were going to just redact the birth parent's name and leave the child's name and the address and all the other stuff. And then the first round of redacted birth certificates that went out, they redacted everything on the birth certificate. And we went back and said, this is not what the law said. This is not the intention of the law. And our sponsor came and spoke with them and said, sometimes you're in a situation where years later, Supreme Court or somebody is figuring out what was meant. Like, you've got me here, I'm the sponsor. This is what we meant, and this is what we wrote, and this is what you agreed to, and this isn't what you did. And so they did, it took a little while, but they did go back and fix that. I know that Barbara Shaw was trying to speak.
No, just a quick thank you, not so much a question. My son was born in Toledo in 1967. And so I just want to thank everybody for how hard they worked to get that open, because I did tell him that he could have his birth certificate now if he wants it. So thank you for it. I know how hard you all worked. We tried to do it in California in the 90s, and it was pretty frustrating. So but you never gave up, and it's wonderful. And I'm so excited that he can have his birth certificate.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that we found, I think, that's good to know from other states is that different states in their constitution have different provisions. And so in Ohio, because the law was written so that a judge could open up and adopt when the records were closed during that period. The law was written originally, the law that my dad worked on, so that a judge could open up the record to the adoptee. And I think actually my dad was the one that got that in there, that, when the other parents were saying, no, it should be closed, he was kind of like, yeah, but if there's a real reason, then, the judge should have the ability to open them. And that's what saved us in a way, because it was a procedural right versus, like this, they weren't completely closed. It was just what was the procedure to get them. And so because they were never, that helped to make the argument that nobody could have promised a birth parent they'd be closed, because any given record could be opened by a judge in the law. And so it was really just the procedure, can they be opened upon request? Can they be opened upon a judge's discretion? Actually, the judges came around and supported us in the end, because they were like, oh, good, less, we're overworked, less people come into, into our courtroom for stuff, we'd rather not be in the middle of it. And judges, for the most part, weren't opening records anyways. I think I know of one over all the years that somebody actually did open.
I have a quick question, and I forget the number of the amendment, but I guess I've heard, over the years that this argument just doesn't work, but it's in the Constitution that you can't keep a right from somebody that everybody else in the country has the right to. Does anyone remember the number of the constitutional amendment that is? In other words, it really is unconstitutional to withhold birth certificates from a certain class of people that everybody else can have. And I've heard from so many people that have worked so hard in this area that that's just an argument that just doesn't really work with the legislators and so forth.
Yeah, that's beyond my area of expertise, but I know that this has gone up through the court system several different times over the years, and the courts have not found that, the courts have said, and this is oversimplifying, but it's about the best I can do. That courts have really said that it's not unconstitutional for states to choose to keep. It's a legislative issue that they can choose to keep them closed. They can choose to open them. But that it wasn't really a court issue or a given right, is my limited understanding of that. Before we end, just so that I don't end and forget to say, we do have Adoption Network has a couple things coming up, and so I'm actually putting the link to our calendar in the chat, which I think you've already put in, but we have a Monday evening speaker series, which is a lot like this. And we also started, I think about the same time, right when the pandemic hit, a way to stay together, a way to enhance discussion, lift everybody's spirits. And so not every single Monday evening, but the majority of Monday evenings, we have something. And this coming Monday, we have Ron Needham, who some people might know from American Adoption Congress conferences. He does a workshop that sometimes is called Adoptee Romantic Radar. We're calling it the Trouble with Love Adoptees. Basically, it's about relationships and what leads adoptees into certain types of relationships, for better or worse. So he will be great. Ron is wonderful. He's a really good speaker and an engaging person. And then the next Monday, we're having the This Is Us discussion that was mentioned earlier. I saw some registrations popping in my email, so I'm assuming that's people that heard about it here. And so Barbara leads that with one of our adoptive parents. We have a transracial support group. And so she leads it with the parent who leads that group. On April 16th, which is actually a Friday in the afternoon, we're working with the Ali Foundation, which is in London. And we're having Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a addiction specialist. And that is called The Trauma of Relinquishment, Adoption, Addiction, and Beyond. And that will also be excellent. He lives in British Columbia. Zara Phillips will be interviewing him. And so we had to figure out British Columbia time, Ohio time, London time. So it's at 1 p.m. on Friday the 16th. And then we have several other speakers coming up in our Monday evening series that you can take a look at.
Great. Thank you so much, Betsy. We really appreciate it. I know Paul Kimball is also here with us this evening, and he had posed a question. So I'm just going to reframe this for you. For an individual that wanted to get started in legislation, what would be your advice? How one person could start? What's the advice here, Betsy?
I think, I don't know, there's a lot of different starting places, but I think, one is to make sure you're not operating in a vacuum. Learn the history in your state, learn who the other players are in your state. I don't know if whoever asked that question wants to share what state you're in, you can put it in the chat. Yeah. But, if there's other people who if there have been attempts in the past, make sure that you're clued into that. You don't want to just be operating in a vacuum if you can help it. And, that said, everybody has to start somewhere. And so I would start with your own legislators in your district. So your state senator and your state representative. One of the things I learned over the years is a lot of people don't know that we have a state legislature, and so people are like, "Oh yeah, I know who our senator is, Sherrod Brown." And they automatically think about the federal level, and so get cued into your state legislature, find out who's in the majority in your state legislature. So in Ohio, and this was not always the case, but like right now, for instance, Republicans have a supermajority both in the House and the Senate. Which is unusual, but make sure that you know who's in power. This should not be a partisan issue, but unfortunately it often becomes one. But you want to craft your arguments and find a sponsor of the majority party and make sure that you have ways to explain it to that, to that constituency. One of the things that I've found is that legislators want you to simplify things. And so this is a complicated issue, but if you're going into their office with like a whole binder of materials, they're going to be like, give me a one pager. You got to really boil it down to your bullet points. And we actually on that legislative archive on our website did put, and they're a little dated now, but our one pagers that we used, and we had a couple different one pagers, one that was nuts and bolts of the bill and one that was like common myths and the arguments against those. like I said, you don't use them verbatim because those were 6, 7, 8 years old now. But you really kind of have to boil it down to simplify so that you can leave something with them that's descriptive. And one of the things I learned even after our bill passed is that the implementation phase, and we touched on this, I think, when Becky brought up about the redactions and it not going the way that, it was bad enough the way that, it got passed, and then it was way worse the way that they started implementing it. But that whole implementation of the bill was really as important as the legislation. Our Vital Records Office interpreted many of the things in the legislation in ways that we, weren't really, that's not really the most user-friendly way to do it. So there was a lot of discussion back and forth with them to get it implemented the way that we anticipated, the way we envisioned it to be. And if we had just said, okay, our job is done, we're done, the access that people actually get could look very different. In Ohio, it's the adoptee and then linear descendants of the adoptee. And at one point they were saying, well, descendants are only the next generation. And we were like, no, descendants are descendants, generations full of descendants. So sometimes the details can be, I'm trying to think, there were several things like that this could look very different if we hadn't stuck with it. So I know that's beyond what your question was, but an important piece people don't always think about.
You want to take yourself off mute, Paul?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Question.
Yeah. Just by the way, a fantastic event right here. Betsy, we're actually moving here in California. I contacted my state senator, who immediately contacted me back.
Oh, good.
And immediately set me up with one of her lawyers who I happen to know. It was one of those mind-blowing things. So one of the things they said, and some of our Californians were asking about this in the chat, California doesn't want to be last. So they're very pro doing this. They want to start working on it this summer once the calendar sets for that, and possibly get something in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So I might be asking you a little bit hows and whys. And the same thing, Marcy, you had talked about that famous lawyer that has already, so I'll be hitting you guys up for that.
Yeah, happy to share. So my limited understanding about California is, and I think I started to allude to this, that different state constitutions are different. I do, and Barbara, maybe you know more about this than I do, but I think that the California, one of the stumbling blocks in the 90s when they had bills on this topic was that there was something in the Constitution about no retroactive laws, and the way the law stood, that there's complications. That doesn't mean they can't be overcome, but it's one of the things you should do is to definitely become as aware of the history and what the previous challenges have been, because otherwise you'll just repeat the past.
Right.
And I'll just add, Paul, that I kept a lot of the papers from the 90s, and I have to say, interesting, the bill that we were trying to get through in the 90s was an adoptive father who was a state congressperson was sponsoring the bill. It actually got through the House and the Senate, but it got to Ways and Means, and they killed it in Ways and Means. And two of the issues was, it's going to cost too much money to contact. We want to contact all the birth mothers, make sure, that's okay. And then Bill Pierce, of course, of the infamous Bill Pierce, he brought a very young birth mother in, and she introduced herself, but she wanted secrecy. So what we had to say was washed away, because she talked about how she wanted to keep her privacy. So those two issues, I hate to say that it was two Democrats that on that committee that were really, really against it. But Betsy made a very good point. Kind of check, you might have already done this, but really check the history. Right. Of how it is. And there's somebody from California, I think it was Coco, on another thing, said something about the HIPAA law, and that's why it's so hard to get it open. But HIPAA, I don't see any connection with the HIPAA law. That didn't make any sense. Because that's like, you can't tell somebody's medical records. This isn't about a medical record. But yeah, there's, so good for you guys. I hope I still have a ton of paper stuff from that era that I kept, if you ever want it. So I don't know, I could give you my address or whatever, but yeah, so good moving forward, and times change, so hopefully, it'll pass sometime.
Well, that's interesting. That, you brought up Bill Pearson, then bringing in a birth mother in our hearings in the 90s. They brought in, one adoptee, one birth parent, one adoptive parent who were against us, and the birth parent, her name was just Eve, and she didn't have a last name, and I happened to be sitting behind her, and she literally had fill in the blank testimony. So it was this woman up there, whether or not she was a birth mother, who knows, but somebody had for her, my name is, and you could see it was like for her to fill in, and the whole story. And it's very hard to, the legislature is very interested in protecting that one person. You'd think they'd be making a law for the majority, but they see them as the protectors of that one person who won't come forward, who's too scared and too silenced.
And boy, I would love to know what she's doing today. I have no idea who she was, but boy, I keep thinking, surely she evolved, if she ever really kind of regretted doing that, because she could have been found, The other issue too is that it's easy to find in California. It's just easy. Most everybody can do that. I don't know all the details, but I kind of know a little bit about why that's true. But that's not the issue. The issue is having that piece of paper. It's a birth certificate. So just because I've heard some people use that as an excuse. Well, it's easy to find in California, but I think they're missing the point. You're the adoptees, you tell me. It's not about that so much as their right to have their birth certificate,
Adoptees want their birth certificate whether or not they're searching. It's not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway.
Things that we ensure, just another little nugget. One of the things that we ensured in our law was, I've seen a couple multi-state adoptees, like born in one state and adopted another in the chat. And of course, Ohio only has the records that were initiated in Ohio, but we did ensure that if somebody was born in Ohio, but then adopted in a different state, that they would still be able to access their Ohio birth certificate.
Okay.
So that's an important little, like it means the world to the people that it affects. Unfortunately, we couldn't go both ways. If somebody was born somewhere else and then adopted in Ohio would not have their birth certificate to release. So it could only go that one way. But, that's been really important for some people.
Yeah, each state is so different and complicated. And they don't seem to really take into consideration that there's 2 states here that never did close, and nobody, it's not, there's no, I mean, I don't know, but there's just never been an issue about that. Nobody's, hold on a second. I'm just going to put my email address here in case Paul wants it. I don't know. He probably has all the information he needs, but anyway.
Oh, no.
I just have kept some of that stuff anyway, so.
Gene Scott, who made those documentaries about access records, also was really active in the California bills in the 90s.
Yeah.
So she might know some of the history as well. If you're looking to talk to people.
Yeah,
But that's great if you've got an interested legislator. That's really fantastic.
That is, Paul. Good for you. That's what it's kind of I'm the Pickens County, Colorado coordinator for Colorado Voters for Animals. So I'm learning, it has nothing to do with adoption, but I'm learning a lot about how you get a bill passed. Of course, this past year, everything was on hold, but now things are, opening up. We're trying to get a ban on trophy hunting and mountain lions and different things. But anyway, it is a wonderfully interesting process, and to know kind of how to navigate and how to kind of approach some of these legislators. I'm still learning. I'm still really learning because, and it's another very emotional issue because we have, we're a huge ranching, hunting state. I wish we could kick all the hunters out of here, but they come, especially I want to protect our black bears, but it is, yeah. So, really educating yourself on how to approach a legislator. And of course, Betsy, you're the expert on this for sure.
So legislation, we've got some other legislative initiatives right now. We're working on fertility fraud. So like when doctors use their own genetic material instead of the donors that they were supposed to use. So people were conceived and finding that out and finding out that lo and behold, it was the fertility doctor's sperm. We've also had a bill in the past that is going to be another multi-attempt thing. So we're going to have to do it again because it didn't pass, but around siblings. So when siblings come into foster care, best practice is for them to be placed together, but sometimes they get separated over the years before they're adopted or whatever happens. Sometimes siblings don't come in at the same time. And I never really thought about this, but siblings are siblings because they have the same parents. And so if they end up terminating parental rights through the foster care system, and they don't have the same parents anymore, they're not legally siblings. They're not entitled to that relationship. And so we crafted a bill to fix that, which was introduced about 3 or 4 years ago, and it didn't go anywhere the first time around. But we're going to be back at that soon.
Good for you. That's just so disturbing that you would separate siblings like that. I mean, that's such a strong bond. I mean, if they don't have their parents anymore, I mean, anyway.
Right. Siblings are
Crazy stuff.
Well, it's getting to be that time, and thank everyone. I'd like to thank each one of you for your comments this evening and joining us. And Betsy, it's just been a real pleasure to have you here on NAP's Happy Hour, and we hope to see a lot more of you in the future. Now, so. And we will be sharing, again, your events that you shared with us today. Jennifer will get that up on the calendar. You're welcome to join us over at the Adoption Happy Hour Facebook page. We continue discussions over there and any events. Please take the moment to do that for us as well. And before we close, I would like to introduce our next week's guest, if we have just a moment. Jennifer, do you have the slide ready? Oh, it's Mr. Paul Campbell from California. How about that?
Unbelievable.
Yes. Well, next week we'll be having Paul Campbell. I just finished his book, We Are All Human Beings. And he's going to share his personal journey with us next week. And we'll hope you'll check out his book on Amazon as well. And he's got a really interesting story to share. And I think some music may be involved. So you'll want to mark your calendars for next week. Thank you. Anybody have any last minute comments or thoughts before we leave? No? If not, everybody have a great week, and we will see you on Friday again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy.
Stay on for just one
Fired
second,
up.
please. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.